Chapter 4, Meetings with the Self. We can translate our responses. We have an ability to correctly identify our responses and translate them, if needed, to a diverse expressive modality. When our responses represent rigid fragments, they are not adaptable and are hard to express. Our goal is to identify the response that we are ready to express. The responses, which are the rigid type, are not easy to identify. To facilitate identification, we perhaps need to translate them to a more flexible modality. The rigidity and flexibility of responses may possibly be on an oral, visual, or kinesthetic expressive modality. Our psyches do not consciously set apart the modalities by the level of their rigidity, but because we express them verbally. It is very important to identify our rigid and flexible modalities because they determine special psyche organizations. The capacity to understand stimuli is part of our response-forming processor. To verbalize the experience, we rely on the subconscious use of the universal translator. The universal translator is an interpreter of our responses from dissimilar modalities to verbal expressions. We all have psyche organization that includes the flexible and rigid modalities, as well as fragments on diverse modalities. Plasticity is the most important part of the psyche structure, the internal conflict causing the splitting of the psyche on rigid fragments. In other words, the psyche acts like the library of responses on distinctive stimulations. We are able to distinguish from our visual, oral, and kinesthetic modalities which one is currently domineering in our psyche. The ability to identify and correctly translate our responses to the most flexible modality is a sign of the ego's strength. The professor of engineering responds in an alternative way compared to someone else with a different domineering modality. His identity relies on the domineering visual part of his psyche, which responds flexibly on visual stimulations. He is also an athlete and a sexually active man with a well-developed kinesthetic response. As someone who loves poetry, he develops oral parts as well. His oral and kinesthetic modalities produce rigid responses, and he has an ability to translate them to more flexible manners. Just like our professor of engineering, distinctive individuals have diverse styled responses. In the perfect situation, all those expressions are harmonious and flexible, but when the identity has many internal conflicts, it falls apart on fixated fragments. The professor's sexual preferences are not part of his visual expressions that distinguish him in engineering. Nevertheless, they are important in his everyday interactions. It is important that the professor's choices in music, which vary from classical to electronic, create an especially nice aspect of his psyche. His behavior becomes unpredictable when his rigid fragments take over his psyche without his conscious awareness. One story about the professor of engineering was that he was madly in love with a student in his class, a young brunette with glasses who was not a very good student. She listened to the professor, and it appeared that she was completely consumed by his knowledge. The naive professor possibly was not able to understand that a young student was playing him. Another story was that deeply in the professor's heart was an enthusiastic composer, and he dreamed that he would resign from his engineering, give up all his engineering books, and pursue a musical publication. Those stories reveal that the professor's psyche is not strongly resisting attempts of takeover by the fragments on various modalities. His fragments of sexual needs are connected with a kinesthetic type of expression. His engineering skills are visual, and his dreams of music are oral. To avoid a crack, he needs to identify the rigid fragments and what type of expressions they represent, and then he can translate them to a flexible style of expression. The professor's identity is built on a visual modality, and he needs to translate the oral and kinesthetic responses to visual. Then he will be able to see, feel, and hear. The damaged psyche is splitting. The psyche can be damaged by internal conflicts or by external pressure. As a result, the psyche splits on fragments with diverse levels of association and disassociation. Some psyches have a loose association. The mild damage occurs as a result of splitting caused by non-hostile disagreements. Moderate damage is a result of hostile confrontations like divorce, custody disputes, and natural death of the family members. The psyche may even have severe damages that deform the whole structure. Severe damage can be the result of post-traumatic stress, seeing a violent death, mental illness, and disassociations. Damaged psyches maintain loose association between fragments. Nevertheless, those psyches are poles apart from the psyche with multiple personalities, which have several completely disassociated and dissimilar egos. The diverse egos and multiple personalities split on fragments that fight to take over the psyche. Contrary to multiple personalities, the loose associated fragments do not have a notion of lost time, but they do suffer from the feeling of uncertainty and confusion. When dissimilar fragments take over our psyche, they change our behavior. The sudden changes are involuntary, and without conscious decision, we are not even aware that we were the objects of the ego's changes and fragmentation. Consciously, we do not know what fragment is taking over our psyche, but we feel confusion about others in our surroundings. When we fragment, our identity is very unstable. Other people have the complex task to understand what we need and what to expect from us. We have the task to incorporate the diverse fragments to one identity and to build a stable psyche. We need to solidify our psyche in order to have stable associations. It is very important to identify fragments that are involved in hostility and feuds. We create a big turmoil by our inability to maintain a stable identity. With an unstable identity, our task is to interact with others is very tricky because of the internal disarray. We have a hard time maintaining feelings of self-esteem and self-worth. We are unsure of who we are and how to react in distinctive situations. The unpredictability of our actions and our unexpected behavior creates feelings of fear and uncertainty. If our identity is shaky and unstable, we may be exhausted by an assignment that we are not able to accomplish. A life with an undeveloped identity is similar to the life of a caterpillar that will never become a butterfly. All his existence, the caterpillar is not able to fly and does not have the forms and colors of the butterfly that we admire. With a fragmented psyche, we do not know much about the self. We are aware that we are at the mercy of some power forces and we often feel possessed. We do not know that we are dealing with the forces of splitting. Fragments with distinctive levels of association and disassociation cause our discomfort. We might be able to correct wrong responses. Our psyche is organized in a way that we have the ability to correct wrong responses. By using the universal translator, we translate responses to dissimilar manners of expression. If our stimulations cannot produce correct responses in one form, then we use other available styles. Sometimes we correctly respond in a dissimilar mode of expression to visual, oral, and kinesthetic triggers. However, when our psyche endures the severe trauma, we cannot process the stimulations correctly. Our rigid fragments constantly act as the trauma reoccurs. We release brain chemicals that are not congruent to the stimulations, and we disassociate from events comparable in stimulation. Our psyche overacts or produces an insufficient response. When the stimulations reach our damaged substructure, we get confused and we do not feel that we understand the others. It seems that others do not appreciate us. After traumatic events that cause the disassociation, our psyche can split from the other associations. Our fragments resemble a damaged music record which goes in a circle, plays only one tune, and is not capable of continuing with the rest of the song. Our damaged fragments have limitations and cannot process stimulation in a flexible way, producing only fear and anger responses. Because the process is on a subconscious level, we are not in control of our psyche. In reality, our responses depend on the release of the brain chemicals, which are produced and released in diverse areas of our brain. The interactions of the chemicals are on the physiological level. The dissimilar mixture of our brain chemicals creates rigid and flexible fragments. If we had a cookbook that describes the release of brain chemicals, then we would have the measurements of the fixated and flexible ingredients in our brain. To be in control of our psyche, we bring interactions of our fragments to the conscious level. By bringing the unconscious process to the conscious level, we learn about the incongruence of our responses and are aware that our heredity also plays a very important role. It seems that our genetics plays a part in our stability and in the speedy recuperation from damage. Some psyches have the ability to recuperate and regroup faster after trauma, but for others, trauma is very painful and rehabilitation takes a long time. Nevertheless, our psyche has some ability to correct abnormal responses. We have an important ability to choose the manner of responses. By connecting the stimulations to the responses, the psyche processes the information on distinctive styles. Our fragments are associated with oral, visual, or kinesthetic expressions, and in many instances, the stimulations that belong to one particular approach trigger the same type of responses. When we have kinesthetic stimulations, our reactions are kinesthetic, but when we yell and make faces, then our quick responses are visual and oral. We cannot adequately respond to the stimulations because we only have the one way of reacting to dissimilar stimulations. The capacity to understand stimuli is part of our response-forming processor. To verbalize the experience, we rely on the subconscious use of a universal translator. The universal translator is an interpreter of our responses from dissimilar modalities to verbal expressions. We all have psyche organization that includes the flexible and rigid modalities, as well as fragments on diverse modalities. Plasticity is the most important part of the psyche structure. The internal conflict causes the splitting of the psyche on rigid fragments. In other words, the psyche acts like a library of responses on distinctive stimulations. We are able to distinguish from our verbal, oral, visual, and kinesthetic modalities, which is one currently dominating in our psyche. The ability to identify and correctly translate our responses is the most flexible modality and the sign of an ego strength. The professor of engineering responds in an alternative way compared to someone else with a different domineering modality. His identity relies on the domineering visual part of his psyche, which responds flexibly on visual stimulation. Our rigid responses include facial expressions, distinctive sounds, and angry gestures. We are connected to the universal translator, and all our responses become verbal. By using the universal translator, we are able to modify our responses and make them less rigid. To achieve our goal is to have a flexible response. We use our diverse styles of expression because the psyche provides us with many comparable responses. When the stimulations trigger the flexible responses, we are in control. To correct the damaged fragment that produces a rigid response, we can replace this rigid fragment with a flexible one on a different modality by using the more comparable types of expression to produce a distinct response. Plasticity is one of the most important characteristics. Plasticity is a very important characteristic of our psyche. The plasticity of our brain is represented by distinctive manifestations. When we look forward to changes, then the plasticity of our psyche is revealed. When we have enough plasticity to alter the biochemistry in our brain, the psyche is not rigid. The one method of analysis of the psyche is strictly physiological. We understand the difficulty of learning physiology and the paths of the brain chemicals. Without extended knowledge and sophisticated equipment, we are not able to use this method. The other method is psychological, and we can perhaps evaluate the psyche through our observation. We understand that the most important characteristic of plasticity is our mechanism to control with stress and our desire to be successful. We analyze how to make the right decisions and how to act under pressure. The presence of plasticity is observed when the brain successfully deals with stress, correctly assesses the situation, and finds the best solution. The characteristic of the brain that is opposite to plasticity is a precursor of rigidity. The warning of rigidity can be observed when we act paralyzed by stress and do not have the ability to find the correct solution. One of the outcomes of our trauma is inflexibility and the release of brain chemicals, which creates a chemical imbalance. The disproportional discharge of the brain's chemicals causes confusion and stress. Some of us are very thoughtful and help others with priceless advice, but we love those qualities when we solve our own. Some of us are very thoughtful and help others with priceless advice, but we lose those qualities when we solve our own problems. This is a warning of rigidity caused by stress, which makes us act paralyzed when we face our own problems. Our life changes usually go together with stress, and we are fearful of these changes. The feelings of fearfulness are formed by the expectation of discomfort even after a minor change. Our negativity is an indicator of low adaptability and a lack of plasticity, which are triggered by an anticipation of the worst. Everyone has at least some stress. The charges for dealing with the diverse stages of life, deteriorating health, marriage, children, and more are often very costly. The anxiety and fears cause a splitting in our psyche, and the lack of adaptability deprives us from environmental support. Resistance to the change creates fixated fragments, causes the strenuous pressure on our brain, and prevents the release of congruent brain chemicals. Our painful sensitivity to stress is a precursor to deficiency in coping ability. Fearfulness and discomfort are indications of rigidity in the releasing of brain chemicals. The psychological side of inflexibility appears when we are reluctant to accept challenge and display abnormal behaviors such as avoidance, anger, discomfort, and irritability. It is very important to develop plasticity of our fragment because plasticity is the most desirable characteristic of our psyche. We assume that our plasticity on the biochemical and psychological levels is present when our brain chemistry can easily regroup and our responses are congruent to stimulations. Our plasticity is present when we feel adequate. The level of abnormality in our responses. The abnormality of our responses may perhaps be estimated by the severity of splitting. Our psyche has a tendency for both splitting and unification. Our healthy fragments are flexible, exhibiting plasticity and having good coping skills. Our fixated fragments lack flexibility and have a tendency to split and disassociate. The groups of our fragments that together produce our fixated replies are responsible for abnormal responses. Our surrounding environmental conditions are very important to understanding our special characteristics and responses. Our surrounding environmental conditions are very important to understanding our special characteristics and responses. To survive harsh conditions in a stressful environment, our psyche creates more fixated fragments. Even though all fragments have access to the information stored in the memory base, our fixated fragments avoid particular areas, and our memories are selective. Some fragments are very loosely associated and are on the verge of dissociation. Based on hereditary and environmental conditions, our psyche has distinctive levels of stress tolerance. Our disassociated psyche has an inclination towards splitting. Extreme stress can cause complete disassociation in the psyche. The detached psyche constructs the new structure from the collection of disassociated fragments, creating its own completely new memory base. Because it does not have any access to the original memory base, it compensates for the lack of information by fabricating dissimilar memory data and creating false memory. Our new structure, which does not have access to the former memory base, is not able to learn from previous information. We make up the fabricated life histories, which are far from our real histories. The new structure presents the fabricated memories, which are not corresponding with bits of preserved images. The new memory contains fictitious information about our life, including age, marital status, and information about parents and children. Our fabrication is a symptom of the disassociated constructs. The damages exhibit the self in our abnormal responses. Because of the harsh environment, our psyche develops a new organizational structure which splits from the existing construction. If our new organizational structure passes the test of reality, then our new construct becomes independent. Sometimes our dissimilar structures are aware of others, and by competing for dominance, they are hostile to the others. They insist that they are using real information, but they use fabricated data and have false memories. In people with multiple personalities, the brain produces a unique cocktail of chemicals for atypical structures and creates new files for memory data. Access to the independent memory base is closed or restricted. Our level of disassociation is an indication of the severity of the damage. Our responses rely on information. Our responses rely on our ability to properly receive and translate information. Because of incorrect translations, we get inadequate reactions, and others judge us by our replies. To be valued, we need to be sure that the stimulations translate correctly and that we generate the appropriate responses. By our level of congruency between stimulations and responses, we have been graded for smartness and geniality. Unfortunately, we do not consciously know what triggered the abnormal responses. We also are not aware of the consequences when the stimulations translate in an abnormal way. Until we get into big trouble, we do not even concern ourselves with what went wrong with our responses and why others got offended. We do not know that our interpretation of stimulation might perhaps be affected by chemical imbalance, heredity, environment, faulty parenting, and psychological and organic damage. Our ability to translate received information also depends on our traditions and backgrounds. We wonder why we are always wrong and why our replies are not congruent. If supplied with faulty translation, even a brilliant mind cannot arrive at the correct response. When we do not produce an accurate response, we feel bewildered and are uncertain about our abilities and experience a feeling of helplessness. We get confused and are not certain that we will ever be able to arrive at the correct response. The whole stability of our identity depends on the correctness of translating stimulations. Because we produce abnormal responses, others will avoid us, although we don't understand why. There are diverse reasons why we generate wrong responses. We feel the most pain when our process is correct, but for some reason the stimulation is wrongly submitted. Sometimes the stimulations are damaged on intake by our perception apparatus, so already deformed stimulations are presented for translation. Our identity depends on the individual manner of the receiving and translating of the information. Depending on the approach, our psyche is divided into several groups, where each group organizes matching fragments. The comparable responses may perhaps be on diverse manners of expression, which includes visual, oral, tactile, kinesthetic, olfactory, and mixed senses. Each style triggers the release of diverse brain chemicals. Each group of fragments has unique areas in the brain for processing similar information and producing similar responses. After receiving the psychological trauma, we realize that the environment does not support our desire for unity, and our psyche falls apart and restructures the previous organizational arrangements, creating new dominant areas. Because the previous method of receiving and translating the information brought enormous stress, a victim might avoid common ways of processing information. The victim's responses now rely on uncommon ways of receiving and decoding information. When our responses change, we need to understand these new changes. If the previous identity was built on visual responses and we gathered information through visual stimulations, then we face a disastrous situation. Our new identity may decide to abandon visual processing and focus on the oral and kinesthetic. A woman prior to a date rape attack may have wanted to impress handsome men, but after being attacked, she is no longer interested in visual stimulation and she does not use tight clothes to impress her dates anymore. Now, the victim is firm in visual responses and relies more on the processing of oral stimulations for detecting expressions of compassion and tenderness instead of good looks. She observes the kinesthetic manner of the man, detecting by his posture if he has a criminal intent, and she also keeps her feelings in control. Because our identity is based on our responses to stimulation, we bring unconscious processes to our conscious level. When we deal with incoming information and our formation of a response is on a subconscious level, we are not capable of changing our way of processing information. To avoid overreaction, underreaction, and confusion, we bring information to the conscious level. We are in control when we knowingly evaluate and translate stimulation, consciously choosing our responses. An opportunity to grow is essential. An opportunity for growth is essential for the development of the psyche. Establishing our identity is not a finite process and continues our entire life. In old age, we are supposed to be more comfortable with our past and our old sufferings, and we expect to have peace with our internal demons. And when we talk about a maturity, we assume that near the end of our life, we will get wiser and softer. The need for dialogue and unification is stronger as we age because we come closer to the time when we are ready to unify with the eternity. In old age, we intuitively look for real meetings with loved ones. In many instances during our life, we failed the complex assignment to meet our loves. Perhaps the meeting with a loved one occurred when the loved one was very sick, or perhaps could not be an equal participant. In many instances, we really meet famous artists and scientists only after their death. They could not benefit from our recognition. Only if we are fortunate do we get real meetings with loved ones during our active life. If we grow up with a unified psyche, the splitting forces are not able to prevent our real meetings. Nourishing the formation of the psyche is associated with developing plasticity of our fragments with the atmosphere of real meetings and dialogues. Our healthy psyche successfully resists splitting and strives for unification. When our psyche is in the process of unification, then we have an opportunity to develop a solid identity. The opportunities for growth create congruency in the release of the brain's chemistry. Our fragments are the representation of released brain chemicals. When the combination of the released brain chemicals is congruent to stimulations, we respond according to the intensity of the stimulation. Our flexible responses can match the stimulations. The process of unifying our psyche is not an unvarying one. Our psyches also are under constant attack of forces of splitting. The fragments with fixated and suppressive responses put pressure on our psyche to stop unification and to split. The splitting can limit our opportunity for growth or may entirely block our maturation. The lack of opportunities and stresses, life in oppression, and heredity aspects can cause fixated fragments to develop. Fixated fragments conflict with and sabotage self-growth. Flexible fragments are responsible for building the atmosphere of unification and maturation. To avoid conflicts between the fragments, we can identify similar fragments on uncommon forms of expression. We need to carefully translate the stimulants to different modes of expression and consider how the fragments on various manners of expression would respond. Depending on our needs, we can utilize both the fixated and flexible fragments. We can transfer the response from a visual fragment to oral, kinesthetic, or olfactory, and vice versa. We create the atmosphere of meeting and dialogue between our fragments and all available styles of expression, building a background of internal peace, and our identity becomes more solid during real meetings and dialogue. We have an opportunity for unification and feel good about the self and the environment around us. The opportunity for growth is essential to have a solid identity. Flexible responses are the solid parts of our psyche and keep the psyche unified. Tolerance to stress is a very important factor. Tolerance to stress levels is a very important factor in the development of a solid identity. Without tolerance, our identity can easily split apart. The tolerance level is an indicator of our endurance and the presence of flexible fragments. If stress gets stronger, our psyche can give up and our system cracks down in this situation when the stress level gets over the maximum tolerance. When our psyche falls apart, our identity shatters. Our psyche needs to survive, and it creates fixated fragments which are narrow in their responses. The fixated fragments are loosely attached and display the limitation of our functions, having only survival as its goal. The loss of flexibility is similar to the process of intellectual castration, when we do not have any power to generate unique ideas. Our fixated fragments are restricted and produce specific responses, perhaps not creating anything distinguishing. The fixated responses are very predictable. The splitting is a product of the reorganization of our psyche. It can be a result of real or imagined trauma. The splitting perhaps may be an effort to adjust our psyche to different circumstances. It is an attempt to salvage part of our identity. Frequently, splitting happens when the whole system is in danger of destruction. Our psyche can split to preserve our identity from complete obliteration. In a harsh environment, our identity is falling apart. Because of splitting, the psyche leaves intact a few fragments as part of the crushed identity. In other instances, the reorganization by splitting is an effort to break away from our old patterns, which are unhealthy and unproductive. The splitting actions can be very dangerous. Sometimes they are similar to hitting a fly on glass with a metal hammer. The damage from breaking the window is not compatible with the victory of chasing the fly away. We use less damaging tactics to avoid splitting and get stronger, acquiring the desired skills and changing unhealthy habits. Instead of splitting, we have a dialogue and unify with the existing fragments, creating new responses. We alter the psyche without any danger to the existing system. This approach of rearranging our fragments requires some tolerance to unwanted responses. When facing unwanted responses, many psyches exhibit signs of prejudice and narrow-mindedness, which are prerequisites for splitting. However, tolerance as a response may perhaps be built through meetings and dialogue. Without tolerance, our psyche is always on the verge of splitting and encounters stumbling blocks in developing a solid identity. By using tolerance, we stop splitting forces and create a durable identity. The fragmented identity represents the brain's imbalance. A fragmented identity is representation of the imbalance of the brain's chemistry. We display this manifestation of chemistry imbalance by our incongruent reactions to ordinary stimulation. When we are stressed, we produce more fixated fragments and lose the flexibility of our responses. The fixated fragments produce similar repetitive responses on dissimilar life events. When our psyche falls apart, then our identity breaks into fixated fragments, and as a result, Some fragments still are strongly connected and others are loosely associated. The tight fragments represent our identity, but others are disassociated. The wholeness of our identity is closely related to the level of fragmentation and the degree of association between our fragments. When we have a fragmented identity, we repetitively display fixated fragments, and our reactions are easy to predict. In bipolar disorder, the fixated fragments with the opposite responses take over the psyche. Those fragments feud and function in opposition to each other. The actions of our fragments are similar in a new administration that becomes to the power after the revolution and does everything to reverse previous rulings. The fragments in bipolar disorder take over the psyche and the sequential order and produce predictable extreme polarities in responses. Our fragments move by sequential order to become dominating and can be associated with a special time and schedule, though the sequence of the order may be constant or random. Understanding the bipolar process is important to figuring out all forces that are pushing our fragments to becoming domineering. Some changes affect our psyche by particular sequences, which perhaps may be time, magnetic compositions in the atmosphere, or even a variety of other prompts. The change in our mood comes together with changes in our perception and attitude. The disparity is so sudden that we become dissimilar even though we have the same memories and the same habits. We also modify our interpretation of the past, present, and future life events. The change of our responses is also observed when we suffer from borderline personality disorder. As borderlines, we can experience gloominess to produce stable responses. When we have mood changes, we change our attitude towards others, which becomes evident from our responses. With borderline disorder and cyclothymia, we have the complexity to identify sequences of behavior and triggers of mood swings. The sequences and triggers are not as evident and predictable as in bipolar disorder. They become explicable when our domineering fragments change, and our confused psyche can display loose associations. With loose associations, the fixated fragments can take over our entire psyche. Our psyche exhibits reactions that are complicated to predict, and we suddenly display unprovoked anger, hostility, suicidal feelings, and even self-mutilation. Our complete disassociation from the previous organization becomes evident when some of our fragments arrange in a new independent structure that does not contain many shared memories with the preceding one. The disassociation of our psyche is the result of an escape from the old organization to the new and independent structure. The complete splitting happens when our previous structure is unable to keep our identity unified. In a hostile environment and with the goal of surviving, our psyche needs additional information with a completely new memory. To deal with our disassociated personalities, we want to acknowledge our new identity and find the truth that we do not know the self. Multiple personalities are a result of the splitting and termination of associations. To be aware of different personalities, we need to identify the changes in our structure. We do not know too much about the self and suffer from the animosity. We blame and feud with the unstable personalities that rule over us. Loose fragments are a sign of the brain's imbalanced chemistry. By unifying our fragments, we balance our brain's chemistry and begin to understand the self. The unification of our psyche is a complex process and requires knowledge of some of our fixated fragments. Our whole psyche is built from little blocks. One fragment is only one block of our psyche. To understand the whole structure, we need to identify the building blocks in our psyche. When we deal with the entire psyche, failures in communication arise. In many instances, to help the self to be more successful and in the reconstruction of the psyche, we do not work on the whole psyche but only one block. It is much easier to deal with one of our fragments instead of the whole psyche. Our mental problems, addictions, pains, and difficulties can be treated more effectively when we deal with a single fragment as a substitute of the entire psyche. Some areas of our brains are overused, but others are underdeveloped. The release of the same amount of neurotransmitters on divergent stimulants is a sign of our fixation, and our responses are rigid. Certain areas of our brain receive stimulations in the form of response, and we need to react to the stimulations. With the fragmented identity, we keep a few areas of our brain overused. Other areas are underdeveloped because of low demand. We produce quick and similar responses that are responsible for the feelings of anxiety, fears, and anger. We have tormenting actions and become destructive without any stress-provoking conditions. In this situation, our fixated fragments are activated and we are driven by feelings that represent our incongruent release of brain chemicals, and we have responses from the anxiety-producing areas of our brain. The brain's areas that generate fears and anger are usually overused, but areas with anger control and stress management are usually underdeveloped. The congruent release of our brain chemicals is very important. One can characterize the process of rigidity by the release of an inadequate amount of chemicals during complicated life situations. Our fixated fragments stock our brain with rigidity and limit our brain's ability to have appropriate responses. By level of congruency to our responses to stimuli, our psyche provides us with the analysis of our brain's condition. Chemical imbalances cause our brain to overwork in certain areas. In the meantime, we do not utilize adequately the available resources in other areas. We are confused because our responses are unrelated to stimulations. Our psyche is not a simple one, and when the emotional chains break, we are left in turmoil. We do not understand where our responses come from and are unable to compose ourselves. Our responses can be visual, oral, and kinesthetic. With strange responses, our psyche provides us with explicit information. The responses to stimulations are wrong. They are coming from the correct part of our brain where we expect them to be generated. In a fragmented identity, the fragments are loosely allied with others and are not in agreement. Some of our fragments distort our responses instead of support us. We call those fragments the troublemakers because they also affect the brain. We have great ideas and thoughts, but we have not benefited from our ideas and never see the development of any of our plans. Those disappointments are evidence of the fragments that sabotage us. Our fragments provide views of the variety of areas in our brains. Through our fragments, we can understand what kinds of brain chemicals are released and whether they show plasticity or rigidity. When our psyche has fixed fragments, then when triggered by stimulations, our brain does not release the appropriate chemicals. The split of our psyche leads to a disproportional use of areas of the brain that release the same chemicals for unrelated stimulants. When our fragments have plasticity, the brain properly processes the stimulants and receives the correct responses, which are sent to the appropriate area of our brain. A solid identity is characterized by the chemical process when the brain works in balance. In the appropriate areas, the brain releases the amount of chemicals. Feelings of anxiety and anger perhaps can be appropriate. When we have a sudden and disturbing stimulation, then we delegate the response to the fragment, which releases anxiety-provoking chemicals. The stimulations disturb our balance, and the anxiety response is somehow congruent. This response is a kind of an alarm on unusual stimulations and is very appropriate. If we become anxious without any anxiety-provoking stimulations, however, we should be concerned about our reaction. In an indication that our brain overuses the areas that are associated with anxiety, and our fragments unnecessarily trigger anxiety responses. In an anxiety-driven psyche, the areas of the brain that provide the anxiety responses are overused, and the areas where relaxation responses are produced have been underdeveloped. Rebellious and vicious fragments are the main point of self-analysis. The main point of self-analysis is to identify our rebellious and vicious fragments and bring them to our conscious awareness. We must not overlook our troublemaker fragments, which sabotage all of our efforts to unify and be happy. When we analyze our psyche, we need to be sure that we clearly see these fragments. Otherwise, our analysis may be misleading. Our obscure life and unstable environment affect the normal development of our psyche. The stressful changes during our lifespan can cause splits in our psyche. These changes include tragic losses combined with unpleasant life experiences and the development of rebellious fragments. The rebellious fragments are usually in confrontation with the dominant fragments. In many instances, only after a long self-analysis do we have information to identify our rebellious fragments, which probably will revolt against our existing structure. Our rebellious fragments are not the multiple and disassociated one. They are just loosely associated fragments of the same psyche, and they generate conflict with the main structure. Our rebellious fragments are unstable and create unexpected disturbances. Because of our unstable psychological structure, we feel stressed and confused, and we need effort to understand the self. Our unstable psyche's configuration lowers our self-esteem and is an obstacle in our desire to achieve our goals. Note that our brain stores the information like rings on a tree stump, which shows the presence of hardship during the life of the tree. The fragments that correspond to stressful times take over our psyche and become our dominant fragments. The other fragments are semi-independent blocks of our fragmented psyche and have the capacity to align and separate from our dominating fragments and become rebellious. Depending on our ability to process information and communicate the right messages, either we are in agreement or our life is in turmoil. In pathological psyches, the domineering fragment represents the abnormal responses of anger, paranoia, or delusion. In the meantime, the dysfunctional fragment skillfully manipulates the other fragments with threats and intimidations, and it builds a deranged identity. In this situation, the rebellious fragment can be helpful by fighting the viciousness of a dominant configuration. There are instances when an insane fragment makes reasonable decisions. Because the rebellious parts, our unstable identity generates the appropriate responses. To our surroundings, our abnormality may be very confusing. Our rebellious fragments fight the dominant nature, structure, and help the psyche to have appropriate responses. However, there are times when the rebellious fragment sabotages the appropriate responses. The key point of self-analysis is to recognize the troublemakers, the unruly or brutal fragments, and to transfer them to the conscious. Several of our fragments probably are in agreement. They're well integrated and solid, but others can be in confrontation and be splitting. With few exceptions, our identity is maintained by the domineering parts of our psyche. Our domineering fragments are the mirror that projects our identity to outsiders. With appropriate forms of communication, we can present a cohesive identity. We use rebellious fragments to resist the power of the disordered domineering structure because we have the hurdle of dealing with mental problems. We may assume that we interact with the whole psyche of the mentally disordered, but it is not exactly true. We are in contact only with one area of the psyche, interacting with only one fragment. We leave the other fragments, which may be rebellious, out of our view. When we deal with attention deficit, our fragments sabotage the self. We are not sure if attention deficit is associated with disturbed oral, visual, kinesthetic, olfactory, or rebellious responses to stimulation. When we interact with the kinesthetic-based fragment, we need to be sure that we are not ignoring the oral and visual-based fragments, which have the same problem. It is important that we are aware of our rebellious fragments because they may use our inattentiveness to fight the dominant fragments. Only the identification of kinesthetic fragments, together with the oral, visual, and rebellious, may bring to conscious awareness the full picture of the mental disorder. Releasing a variety of chemicals. The diverse regions of our brain produce variations in chemicals. Behind the fragments are the numerous areas of the brain, like a factory, produce the brain's chemicals and mix them in a variety of combinations. The response to stimulation is affected by the amounts and the ingredients of our brain chemicals. When our responses are driven by anxiety and interpret all stimuli as anxiety-provoking, the brain uses chemicals that align with our kinesthetic sensors. Through different combinations of brain chemicals, our feelings can be characterized by worries and physical discomfort, resembling heart attacks and including shortness of breath and even a choking sensation. The symptoms might include increased heart palpitations, a problem with the vision where static objects appear to be moving, dizziness, a lack of coordination, a sensitivity to the sounds, an expectation of catastrophe, exaggeration, and overreaction to insignificant stimuli. The oral and visual areas of the brain can interpret information as mood suppressors. Some of our fragments are associated with traumatic stress and use combinations of the brain's chemicals that were derived from visual, oral, and kinesthetic areas. The fragments, which exhibit a lack of control over stimulations, offer only a few fixated responses. In some instances, our need for survival commands our psyche, splitting us and making more fragments. Our surviving fragments can be a guard who does not trust anyone and constantly checks if a traumatic event can occur. Unfortunately, the alarm is often falsely activated. Without a threat, we do not need to prepare for stress. Nevertheless, our fragmented identity provides fixated responses as if we are in danger. The destinations of the fixated fragments were set a long time ago. By using the same brain areas, we pick up the chemicals to a response for danger. Our domineering fragments interpret the incoming stimuli as danger and prepare for intrusion. We transport the stimuli to the brain area where the fixated responses form. When our flexible fragments represent the use of the chemicals from diverse areas, unfortunately, the fixated fragments restrict them, and our flexible responses do not form. In a fragmented psyche, the interpretation of atypical events depends on the fragment that dominates at a particular time. The restricted, fixated responses are usually complicated, but may also be simple. When our psyche produces a mainly kinesthetic response, it is connected with obsessive-compulsive behavior, which uses chemicals released by kinesthetic, oral, visual, and some hormonal areas. The fragments which are aligned with paranoia are driven by the brain's chemicals from the visual, oral, and kinesthetic areas as well. The fragment associated with schizophrenia uses a cocktail of the brain's chemicals from hormonal, oral, visual, and kinesthetic areas of the brain. The various areas produce these diverse chemicals. The fragment of schizophrenia is restricted to the area of the brain that produces delusion, and it produces restricted chemicals as well. The solid psyche has a flexible structure, has easy access to any diverse areas of the brain, and has plasticity in releasing chemicals that arrive from any of the brain and accurately matching the stimulations. The solid identity has the ability to generate flexible responses. Remembering the diverse amounts and ingredients. Our fragments trigger the release of brain chemicals and have the ability to remember distinctive amounts of the ingredients and where to pick them up again. They also remember where certain chemicals are detected. Our fixated fragments repeat the same emotions because they are unable to change routes to the area where the response is formed. Our fixated fragments memorize the incongruent amounts and generate a release of excessive or inadequate chemicals. They have restricted access to that area and can only get a particular amount of chemicals. In contrast, our flexible fragments get chemicals congruent with the stimulation. They use the flexible recipes in our brain's cocktails and produce adequate responses. The flexible fragments have access to many areas of the brain and use chemicals in accordance with the situation. Fixated fragment can release an excessive amount of chemicals, which is associated with an increase in heart rate and can also result in oral, visual, and kinesthetic stimulation. The word police is an oral stimulation and is packed that includes oral, visual, and kinesthetic pictures of perceived brutality. When anyone yells this word, the brain releases a lot of chemicals and triggers fixated responses, which are responsible for increasing heart rate, tightness of muscles, and the urge to hide. The inadequate amounts of chemicals from the same areas of our brain are associated with feelings of tiredness, numbness of the extremities, and psychosomatic pain. If we suffer from dissociated order, then when the psyche splits into an atypical structure, the connections between stimulations and responses are transferred inaccurately because in the new independent structure, the areas of the brain activate differently. The new formations change the previous combinations of chemicals. Fragments from the new structures create new cocktails, which produce unusual feelings and thoughts. Even when they access the same areas of oral, visual, and kinesthetic processors, they release various combinations of chemicals. In the range of structures, the fragments learn to respond to the same stimuli with new emotions. They use new amounts in combinations, and we have new responses to the situation. Our new formation may have a fixated or flexible release of brain chemicals. The particular combination of brain chemicals. Our reaction to stimulation corresponds to a particular combination of brain chemicals. We create a fragment when the combination of chemicals corresponds to a particular type of response. When our identity is fragmented, we are overwhelmed with emotions that are incongruent with the stimulation. Our brain releases a combination with an excessive or inadequate amount of chemicals. Behind our reaction is a domineering fragment that monitors the release of specific combinations of chemicals. Our psyche remembers how many chemicals were released during the painful stimulation. After the trauma, even when it is not needed, our fragments continue to provide traumatic responses for other events that are completely unrelated to the trauma. The process is similar to the sudden activation of an alarm system without an intruder. In our psyche, we also have fragments that trigger unneeded responses, like the false alarm does. We may proceed in the same way as we deal with the falsely activated security. We shut down the alarm and reprogram the security system. By reversing our fragments trend from splitting to unification, we can change our responses. Our fragments are activated by fixated combinations of brain chemicals, but they become more flexible after intervention. Our goal is to recalibrate our psyche and shut down this false alarm. When we are not changing our responses, our psyche is possibly stocked with fragments and we have a false alarm. Our fixated fragments create the struggle and released fixated combinations of chemicals. Those settled combinations get released again and again until we need to move away from the area affected by the trauma. The fixated fragments are rigid and remember the distinctive combinations of brain chemicals. In contrast, the flexible fragments can adjust the combinations according to the current stimulation, creating different modes of expression. When an area of the brain is in a dissimilar form of expression and produces congruent responses, then it is probably not affected by a traumatic event. Those flexible responses can be activated by the oral, visual, or kinesthetic stimulations. We search our psyche for flexible fragments that produce chemicals congruent with stipulation. We translate the incoming stimulations to our ineffective ways of expression and release the brain's chemicals that match the situation. The goal of solidifying our identity. The goal of solidifying our identity is the same as achieving chemical balance in our brain. The process is based on the concept of the unification of our fragments, and the combinations of the brain chemicals are the driving force behind our feelings and emotions. Because we cannot yet permanently change our psyche's organization just by prescribing medication, we must change the damaged system with the psychological means. In dealing with fragments instead of the brain's chemicals, we can slightly touch the physiological base and the whole chemical system and introduce the more simple explanation of the chemical imbalance. We are not ready to discuss the complicated physiological specifics because it gets very complicated to list the chemicals involved in each response. We deal with physiological processes through psychological analysis and identify what caused the fragmentation and how we use our intelligence in this process of solidifying our psyche. By using psychological interventions, we give the psyche the opportunity to use our insides to organize the self. We change the regulatory system. In our view, the brain is a combination of many fragments. We do not deal with our brain as a monolithic structure. We deal only with the brain's little parts. Instead of direct control by chemicals, we introduce the feedback approach from various areas of the brain. In this approach, we promote change from within. Hopefully, by working with psychological means, we alter the chemical combinations and achieve adjustment in the chemical processes. By reorganizing our fragments, the psyche changes the unwanted and destructive patterns. The fragments are the psychological representation of the physiological processes, and by bringing the chemical processing to the conscious level through the process of fragmentation, we get conscious control of the release of brain chemicals. We can achieve the desired chemical balance by using psychological interventions and by analyzing the relationships between the fragments, which lets us become aware of the appropriateness of our responses. Our goal is to build a solid identity and achieve chemical balance. When the psyche is solid, we act properly to any stimulation, and the brain releases chemicals appropriate to the event. The solid structure of the psyche depends on the chemical processes in distinctive areas of the brain that provide us with the congruent responses. It is similar to the construction of a building where all areas of construction are very important. If built correctly, they are the complete representation of the design. Our responses are products of the brain's stimulations and are not as visible as a construction site. When our identity is fragmented, the chemical structure of the psyche is unstable and displays the lack of interaction between loosely associated fragments. By encouraging interaction, we unify the fragmented psyche and correct inappropriate responses. When the fragments are properly identified and develop a common goal, then the interactions start. By unifying the various fragments in the solid entity, we achieve a balance of brain chemistry. The psyche and computers. The psyche's organization of responses is similar to a computer program. The stimulants follow the already established routes, reaching the area of our brain where responses are formed. Another way of presenting our responses is through combinations of chemicals. Our brain remembers the types of chemicals in the combinations and knows how much can be released for the particular stimulations. It uses the already created database and retrieves the necessary information before combining the existing information with incoming stimulation. The brain calculates the needed amounts of the chemicals, releases them, groups them together in combinations, and stores updated information in the memory. When our chemistry is well balanced, stimulations do not have any strangeness and find the needed area where our brain produces and puts together the appropriate combinations of chemicals. In our psyche, we have a cookbook of the recipes, including the flexible and fixated combinations. Psychology helps to deal with the physiology. The knowledge of the brain's chemistry requires a broad knowledge of physiology. We substitute extensive physiological knowledge with the analysis of fragments. The physiology of the brain is compared with the machine language in computers, but fragmentation is like a high-level computer language, which does not require the knowledge of machinery and uses common languages. Instead of physiology, we use self-analysis and the theory of fragmentation to unify our fragments. We transform our fixated fragments to be flexible. By analyzing the fragments, we find a way to build a solid psyche. The solid psyche is associated with the release of the appropriate combinations of brain chemicals and is similar to flexible fragments, which produce responses congruent to the stimulations. It may possibly be compared with the well-written computer programs on the perfect database. In computer work, every programmer does not know the machine language. Like computer programs, the calculation of the combination of brain chemicals, which is done on a subconscious level, is precise work because any deviations in the amount of ingredients can totally change the response. We are not aware of the amounts of imbalanced chemistry that the brain is producing, but we do know our fragments become fixated because of psychological traumas and developmental problems. When our psyche is not yet recuperated from a trauma, it continues splitting into rigid responses. Our inappropriate responses are formatted when the atypical stimulations get access to the area of our psyche where normally they are not supposed to be. Because of the distress, our brain produces dissimilar chemicals, which causes our responses to be fixated and our psyche falls apart. As a result of damage from trauma, the fragments provide similar responses to completely different stimulations. The fixated fragments can provide anxious and angry responses to stimulations do not have any intent of provoking those emotions. There are symptoms of the fixated fragmentation in the form of flashbacks, tightness, fearfulness, as well as excessive reaction to noise, unpleasant feelings, and anger. The fixated fragments are similar to a damaged computer outcome, which is not congruent with the inputted data. Our psyche uses the wrong data and does not rely on updates. Instead of flexible doses, it produces fixated amounts of chemicals in the combinations, which causes inappropriate responses to stimuli. The splitting is on the subconscious level, and the release of fixated combinations of chemicals is a response to the glitch in the program. It is nothing major with a computer, but we need a programmer to change the faulty parameters. To fix the trouble with fixated fragments, we need to bring the problem to the conscious level, and then we gain ability to change the faulty program in our psyche and remove the glitch.